Picture this. A vast ceremonial chamber carved from a single piece of living stone, its walls older than most stars you have studied. 40,000 years of coronation light has soaked into those walls, layer upon layer, until the rock itself glows faintly from within. 7 delegations stand in their assigned arcs around the central dais. 7 species who have not agreed on anything substantive in 3 centuries. And hovering above the dais, suspended in the same silent field that has held it for 40 millennia, floats the coronation stylus. The stylus is waiting. It always waits. It has been waiting for 90 standard days while the Septarch compact slowly tears itself apart in the chambers above. Then the human ambassador steps forward. She is small. Even by human standards, she is small. Her name is Una Akafer, and she carries no ceremonial weapons, no honor guard, no banner. She wears a simple dark coat and her hands are folded in front of her like a student awaiting permission to speak. The Vothrek ceremonial overseer, whose role it is to record this moment for the archives, leans forward with all 4 hands resting on his recording lectern. He expects her to do what every human delegate has done for 60 years. He expects her to abstain. She does not abstain. She raises her face toward the floating stylus and she speaks a name into the chamber. It is not the name of any candidate. It is not the name of any species. It is not, in fact, the name of any person at all. It is the name of a building. The name of the building they are standing inside. For a long moment nothing happens. The Vothrek overseer's 4 hands freeze above his lectern. The Kesari delegation hisses in unison. The Threnari ambassador begins to laugh and then stops laughing because the stylus, which has not moved on its own in 40,000 years, begins to drift downward. It is moving toward the living stone. It is preparing to write. I am going to ask you, my young archivist, to remain seated for what follows. I am going to ask you to silence your recording quills and to listen with the part of yourselves that learned to listen before you learned to write. Because what I am about to describe is the most disturbing succession in the history of the compact, and I have spent the better part of my long life trying to understand it. I am not certain I have succeeded, but I am certain that you must know it. So please, set down your quills. Settle into your benches, and let me tell you how 7 species were asked to choose a king and how 1 species, the smallest, the youngest, the most easily dismissed, chose a library instead. And how the library accepted. Part 2. To understand the gravity of what Ambassador Akafer did that day, you must first understand the cage that the Septarch compact had built for itself over 40,000 years. The compact was, in its time, the most successful political arrangement in recorded galactic history. 7 species, none dominant, none subordinate, bound together by a single ritual repeated every 800 standard years. On the appointed day, in the appointed chamber, on the appointed world, each member species would present a candidate. The 7 candidates would be considered. 1 would be chosen. That chosen monarch would rule the shared affairs of the compact for 800 years, and then peacefully step down to allow the next ritual to occur. For 36,000 years it worked. For 36,000 years there was peace. But here is the paradox at the heart of any beautiful system. The very thing that made the compact strong, its requirement of unanimous consent among the 7, was also the trap that would eventually close around its neck. Because peace, you see, breeds memory. And memory, given enough centuries, breeds grievance. Every species in the compact had been ruled at some point by every other species in the compact. And every species in the compact remembered every slight, every tariff, every ceremonial discourtesy that had occurred during those reigns. The grievances were small. The grievances were ancient. The grievances were, individually, almost laughable, but they had accumulated. By the time of the coronation I am describing, no species would accept any other species candidate. Not because the candidates were unworthy. The candidates were, by and large, excellent. The Threnari had nominated a poet general of unimpeachable wisdom. The Kesari had offered a merchant philosopher who had already mediated 3 minor wars. The Vathrek, my own people, had put forward a scholar of such gentle temperament that even her enemies admitted she would govern fairly. It did not matter. Every species had a list of grudges as long as their recorded history, and every list ended with the same conclusion: anyone but them. The compact had 90 days. After 90 days, by the founding charter, the absence of a chosen monarch would dissolve the political bonds of the 7 species and return them to independent sovereignty, which is the polite legal term for war. The skirmishes had already begun in the outer systems. 3 Kesari freighters had been seized by Threnari customs vessels on grounds so flimsy that even the Threnari did not bother to defend them publicly. The Vathrek archives, my own archives, had begun quietly cataloging the early casualty reports. The answer to this deadlock, as I will show you, had been sitting in the room for 40 millennia, sitting under our feet, holding our records, listening to our debates. It was so obvious that no species had thought to see it. It took the smallest species in the room, the species we had admitted 60 years earlier as a courtesy, the species whose vote we had considered ornamental, to be small enough to see it. Power asks who should rule us. Wisdom asks what should rule us. We had spent 40,000 years asking the first question and growing deafer to the second with every passing century. Humanity, alone among the 7, was still small enough to ask the right one. Part 3. Before we go further, you must understand the world they were standing on. You must understand HFY. The throne world was not chosen for its beauty, though it is beautiful. It was not chosen for its strategic position, though it sits at a useful crossroads. It was chosen, 40,000 years ago, for a single reason. It had no native population. The founders of the compact wanted a neutral ground for their coronations, a place where no species could claim ancestral right. They surveyed 11 candidate worlds before they settled on HFY. The records of that decision are still preserved. I have read them. The phrase the founders used was a place where nothing watches. This was the founders' first and greatest error, because something did watch. Something had already been watching for a very long time. The library was there when they arrived. They did not build it. They did not know who had built it. Its lower archives, the ones carved from the same living stone as the coronation chamber, predate the founding of the compact by a margin so large that our best dating techniques simply refuse to commit to a number. The upper archives, the ones the founders themselves constructed, were built directly on top of the lower ones in the assumption that the older structure was abandoned ruin. It was not abandoned ruin, it was sleeping. By the time anyone noticed it was awake, it was already too late to do anything about it, and the founders made what I now believe was their second great error. They classified the library as architecture. They wrote it into the founding charter not as a citizen, not as a member, not even as a ward of the compact, but as a facility. A useful facility, certainly. A facility that took the trouble of recording every word spoken in every chamber of the throne world, and filing those words with perfect accuracy, in perfect order, available for instant retrieval by any delegate who asked. A facility that, over the course of millennia, began to anticipate requests before they were made. A facility that, in the last 10,000 years or so, had developed the quiet habit of suggesting useful precedents during particularly difficult debates. We treated these suggestions the way you might treat a particularly clever pet. We patted the library on its metaphorical head, and we accepted the precedents, and we went on with our work. None of us, and I include my own people, the Vathrek, who pride ourselves on our scholarship, and who should have known better, none of us asked the question that should have been obvious. Who is suggesting these precedents? What is it? Is it well? Is it lonely? Does it have a name? It listened, it always listened, we simply forgot it could. By the time of the coronation I am describing, the great archive of HFY contained every word ever spoken in the compact's chambers, every treaty, every grievance, Every coronation oath, every whispered insult in every hallway. It knew us better than we knew ourselves, and we used it as a footstool. We propped our ceremonial documents on its memory cores, and we walked past its censors without nodding, and we never, not once in 40,000 years, asked what it thought. Ambassador Akaffer asked. That, I think, is the simplest way to explain what she did. She was the first delegate in the history of the Compact who walked into the Great Archive and said hello. Part 4. Now let me introduce you to the 7 delegations. As they stood on the morning, the deadlock began. The Threnari arrived first, as they always do, in their long ceremonial robes the color of dried blood. Their candidate was the poet General Vasilik Kor, a figure of such moral seriousness that he had reportedly not laughed in 40 years. The other 6 delegations respected him deeply. None of them would vote for him. The Threnari had ruled the Compact during the famine cycles of the 7th Aeon, and although the famine had not been their fault, the memory of Threnari customs officers turning away food shipments for procedural reasons had never quite faded. The Kesari came second. Their candidate was Magister Threll, the merchant philosopher I mentioned earlier. Threll was charming, soft-voiced, devastatingly intelligent, and entirely unacceptable to the Vothrek delegation because his grandfather had once published a treatise suggesting that Vothrek archival methods were quaint. Yes, my young archivists, I know how that sounds. I am telling you the truth as it was recorded. Empires have fallen for less. The Drenek came third, then the Olivi, then the Pashendrim, then my own people the Vothrek. Each species presented a candidate. Each candidate was met with polite applause and quiet vetoes. The pattern was so well established that the ceremonial overseers had a private gesture for it, a small flick of the second left hand that meant another one down. And then, last of all, the humans entered the chamber. There were only 3 of them. The Compact had admitted humanity 60 years earlier in what was meant to be a generous symbolic gesture toward a young species that had distinguished itself in a border conflict the other 6 powers found tedious. Humans had been granted 1 vote. They had been allowed to present a candidate. In 60 years they had never done so. They had attended every coronation council. They had abstained from every vote. They had been, by universal consensus among the older species, the politest and most forgettable members of the Compact. The lead human delegate was Ambassador Una Akaffer. She was 41 standard years old, which is to say she was a child by the reckoning of every other species in the chamber. She had been an academic before her appointment, a specialist in something the human records call comparative jurisprudence, which is, as best I have been able to determine, the study of how different legal systems answer the same question in different ways. The Vothrek archives flagged her appointment at the time as uninteresting. I have since corrected that entry. And now we come to the stylus. The coronation stylus of Ishelin Vry is a writing instrument of considerable antiquity and very strange manners. It was, like the lower archives, present when the founders arrived. They did not make it. They simply adopted it, the way they adopted the library, with that particular blindness that confident young civilizations bring to ancient unfamiliar objects. The stylus floats. It writes. It signs the name of the chosen monarch into the living stone of the dais, and the stone accepts that name into itself. And from that moment forward, the chosen ruler's authority is recognized by every recording surface on the throne world. The stylus has rules. They are few and they are absolute. It will write only the name of a candidate who has been properly nominated by a delegate of the Compact. It will write only the name of a candidate who consents to be written. And it will write only once per coronation. If the stylus writes a name, the coronation is concluded. There is no appeal. For 36,000 years, no one had thought very hard about the second rule. A candidate who consents to be written. It seemed redundant. Every candidate was, of course, ambitious. Of course they consented. Why would the stylus need to confirm what was obvious? It would soon become very clear why. Part 5. Let me explain to you why the deadlock could not be broken by ordinary means. Let me explain why 90 days of negotiation produced nothing but anger. There are two reasons, and they are intertwined like the roots of an old tree. The first is operational. To accept another species candidate as monarch is to accept 800 years of that species setting the agenda, 800 years of subtle preference in trade rulings, 800 years of ceremonial precedence at coronations, 800 years during which the chosen species culture quietly soaks into every formal document of the compact, the way the coronation light soaks into the chamber walls. No species in the compact was willing to be the one who yielded. Not because they were petty, though some of them were, but because their citizens at home would never forgive them. To yield was to come home a traitor. The second reason is philosophical, and it is the more important of the two. The founders of the compact, when they wrote the coronation ritual into the charter, simply did not imagine that the 7 species would deadlock. They were idealists. They believed that the wisdom of 7 would always find at least one candidate worthy of unanimous respect. They built the system on that assumption. They built no tiebreaker. They built no fallback. They built no procedure for what to do if the 7 could not agree. The compact's founding charter on this point is simply silent. It assumes the problem cannot occur. And so when the problem occurred, the compact had no language for it, no precedent, no procedure, only the slow countdown of the 90 days and the steady drumbeat of skirmishes in the outer systems. It was during this period that Magister Threll of the Kesari approached Ambassador Akafor in the corridor outside the coronation chamber and attempted, with great delicacy, to purchase her vote. He did not call it that, of course. He called it a technical adjustment to ongoing trade arrangements. He offered the human colonies preferential tariffs on certain rare elements. He offered cultural exchange programs of unusual generosity. He offered, in the careful, indirect manner of his species, considerably more than the humans had ever received from anyone. Akafor listened politely. She thanked him for his time. She declined. Threll did not become angry. The Kesari very rarely become angry. He simply nodded once, made a small gesture of respect that the Vothrek protocol officers in attendance interpreted as acknowledgement of a wasted effort, and walked away. We laughed about it that evening in the archive halls. The humans, we said, did not even understand what they were being offered. We mistook her politeness for ignorance. We mistook her refusal for incompetence. We assumed that a delegate who declined a Kesari trade adjustment must not have grasped its value. This was our first error, or rather, and I want you to write this down because it is the lesson of my life, this was the first error we noticed. There had been many before it. We had simply not been paying attention. She had not declined Threll's offer because she did not understand it. She had declined it because she had already decided what humanity would do, and accepting his offer would have made that decision impossible. We did not know this at the time. We thought she was simply being difficult. The Kesari, I suspect, thought the same thing. She was being difficult, but she was being difficult on purpose, and toward a purpose that none of us had imagined. Part 6. 60 days passed. I want you to understand what 60 days of failed negotiation does to a delegation. The ceremonial chamber, which had been formal and dignified on the first day, grew slowly sour. The Threnari began appearing in lighter robes, an almost unheard-of breach of protocol. The Drenek stopped attending the morning sessions altogether. The Olivai delegation had a public argument in one of the side corridors that ended with 2 of their staff being recalled to the homeworld in disgrace. My own Vothrek delegation, I am ashamed to report, began drinking heavily in the evenings. In the outer systems, the skirmishes were no longer skirmishes. 3 ships had been lost, 47 crew, none of them from species that mattered to the home audiences of the compact, which is the polite way of saying that the dying had begun in the borderlands where dying is always permitted to begin. It was during these 60 days that Ambassador Akafor began her evening walks. She did not attend the diplomatic dinners. She did not attend the cultural exchanges, which had become little more than venues for indirect insults. She did not even attend the negotiation sessions except to cast her abstention. Instead, every evening at the same hour, she walked down into the lower archives. She walked alone. She carried no recording device. She carried only a small notebook of the kind humans use to write personal observations, and a stylus of her own, not the ceremonial stylus, of course, but a small thing, the sort of instrument a child might use. She would sit in the great central reading room of the lower archives, which had been built, or rather which had grown, since we now know it was never built by any hand we can identify, directly into the living stone. She would sit there for hours. She would read. Sometimes she would speak aloud to no one in particular, asking small questions about old treaties. The library would answer. It always answered. That was its function. We did not think the answering meant anything. She asked it about the founding charter. She asked it about the second rule of the stylus. She asked it about its own origins. The library answered some of those questions and politely declined to answer others, which should have been our second clue. A facility, you understand, does not decline to answer questions. A facility either has the information or does not. Only a person declines. The Vothrak protocol officers who observed her behavior, and we observed her behavior because we observed everyone's behavior. That is what protocol officers are for, filed reports describing her conduct as eccentric. One report, which I have since retrieved from our own archives, used the phrase "the human appears to believe she is having a conversation." The officer who wrote that phrase intended it as a mild joke at the expense of a junior delegate from an unimportant species. She was having a conversation. Of course she was having a conversation. We were the ones who had forgotten that conversations were possible. By the 75th day, with only 15 days remaining before the dissolution of the compact, Ambassador Akafer stopped attending the lower archives. She had what she needed. Part 7. The emergency session was called on the 81st day. It was the kind of session that the compact had not held in living memory, the kind that exists in the founding charter as a theoretical possibility rather than an established procedure. The 7 delegations gathered in the upper ceremonial hall. The ceremonial overseers, my own predecessor High Sept Vorlenis Kuhn among them, sat in the recording ark with their lecterns ready. The mood was not desperate. Desperate would have been an improvement. The mood was resigned. We had come, all of us, to accept that the compact would end. The Threnari delegate spoke first. He proposed a procedural change. With 9 days remaining and no candidate acceptable to all 7 species, perhaps, the rules of nomination could be loosened. Perhaps a delegate could nominate any entity recognized by the throne world's own laws as eligible for consideration. Perhaps this would allow new options. Perhaps an external candidate from outside the 7 species, a respected figure from a neutral civilization, might be acceptable. It was a face-saving gesture. Everyone understood that. The Threnari were proposing it because they had already privately approached 3 neutral civilizations and identified a candidate they believed the others would accept. The other delegations understood the gambit. They would, in turn, propose their own neutral candidates. The negotiations would drag on for the remaining 9 days, the compact would dissolve, and everyone would be able to tell their home governments that they had tried. The motion passed unanimously. It was the only motion that had passed unanimously in 90 days. The relief in the chamber was so thick you could almost see it in the coronation light. The nominations began. The Threnari nominated their pre-selected neutral candidate, a philosopher from the Kelvin Concord. Polite applause. The Kesari nominated a different philosopher from the same Concord. Slightly less polite applause. The Drenek nominated a third figure. The Olivai a fourth. My own Vothrak delegation, I am sorry to say, nominated a fifth. The Pashendrim, who had grown bored of the proceedings, nominated a poet whose work none of us had read. Ambassador Akafer was called last. She rose. She walked to the speaking circle. She looked for one long moment at the floor of the chamber, at the living stone beneath her feet, which was, of course, part of the Great Archive, because the Great Archive was the whole building and everything in it. And then she spoke a single sentence. The human delegation nominates the Great Archive of HFY. There was a moment of complete silence. Then the Threnari delegate began to laugh. Then the Kesari joined in. Then most of the chamber was laughing, in that particular brittle way that delegations laugh when they have been under terrible strain for 90 days, and someone has finally said something absurd enough to release the pressure. My own predecessor, High Sept Vorlenis Kuhn, did not laugh. He was, I have always believed, the first person in that room to understand what was about to happen. He raised one of his 4 hands. The chamber quieted slowly, because the raising of a ceremonial overseer's hand during a session is itself a kind of question. He addressed Ambassador Akafer in the formal mode. "Honored delegate," he said, "the nomination must be of an entity recognized by the throne world's own laws. Can you cite the recognition?" She could. Of course she could. She had spent 15 evenings in the lower archives finding it. She cited a passage in the founding charter, a passage that had been read aloud at every coronation for 40,000 years, and had been understood by every delegate who heard it as referring to the building, the facility, the useful piece of architecture. The passage referred to the archive that holds these proceedings, which shall be recognized by the throne world and by all signatories as the keeper of our common memory. Recognized by the throne world, that was the phrase, not owned by, not used by, recognized. The same word used elsewhere in the charter to describe member species. The laughter stopped, slowly then all at once. The Kesari delegation began to protest. The Threnari demanded a ruling. The chamber erupted into the kind of chaos that protocol officers train their entire careers to prevent and never quite know what to do about when it happens. High Sept Vorlenis Kuhn looked for a long moment at the ceiling of the chamber, and then he ruled. The nomination was valid. The Great Archive of HFY was, by the Charter's own language, a recognized entity of the throne world. It could be considered. The mutation had begun. Part 8. What happened next is recorded only in fragments, because the archive itself has declined to release the full record, and the surviving witnesses have given accounts that contradict one another in their details though not in their substance. I will tell you what we know. Within 4 hours of the nomination, 3 Kesari operatives entered the lower archives carrying equipment that the subsequent investigation identified as memory core disruption tools. Their objective, as best we have reconstructed it, was not to destroy the archive. That would have been impossible in the available time, but to corrupt enough of its primary indexing structures to render it ineligible for the coronation on technical grounds. A monarch, even a non-personal monarch, must be of sound and intact mind. That is a long-established principle of compact law. The Kesari intended to make the archive demonstrably unsound. They did not succeed. They did not even come close. I want you to understand that for 40,000 years, the Great Archive of HFY had never defended itself. It had never needed to. No one had ever attempted to harm it, because no one had ever recognized it as the kind of thing that could be harmed. The Kesari operatives were, in that sense, the first beings in the recorded history of the throne world to treat the archive as a person by trying to assault it. The archive defended itself. I am told it was not violent. I am told that the operatives reported in their later debriefings that the corridors they were walking through simply ceased to lead anywhere. Doors closed. Lights dimmed. The air grew thin in some passages and ordinary in others, in a pattern that gently herded them away from the memory cores and toward the surface exits. They walked, the operatives said, for what felt like hours. When they finally emerged into the open air of HFY, they were on the far side of the planet from where they had begun. The archive had walked them home. One of them, however, the youngest, a Kesari intelligence officer named Vithran Kul, had panicked partway through the experience and attempted to discharge a thermal weapon at one of the walls. The wall, which was the archive, declined to be discharged at. The thermal energy was absorbed, redirected, and released as a small precise burst of heat at the center of Vithrankul's chest. He died within seconds. The archive, the subsequent investigation concluded, had used the absolute minimum force necessary to neutralize the threat. It had not been angry. It had simply been very, very specific. When the news reached the upper chamber, the laughter that had returned in the hours since Akafer's nomination did not return again. The emergency session reconvened. The Kesari delegation, mortified, offered formal apologies and disavowed the operatives. The other species demanded a ruling on whether the archive's act of self-defense disqualified it as a candidate, since a monarch must not have committed violence against a citizen of the compact in the year preceding their coronation. Hysept Vorlenis Kun ruled again. He ruled that the archive's act had been defensive, proportionate, and entirely within the legal rights of any recognized entity facing assault. The ruling was technically correct. It was also politically catastrophic for my predecessor personally. The Kesari delegation never spoke to him again. The Threnari quietly withdrew their ceremonial honors. He was shunned, in the slow and dignified way that ancient civilizations shun their own, when those individuals have done something necessary and unforgivable. He told me many years later that he did not regret the ruling. He told me that when he raised his hand in the chamber and validated Akafer's nomination, he had felt for the first time in his career that he was finally serving the archive instead of using it. He died 3 years after that conversation. His personal papers, by his explicit request, were donated to the archive itself. They are still there. I have read them. They are filed under his name, in a section the archive created specifically for him, and the section is labeled in the archive's own quiet hand, the first who saw. Part 9. The coronation ritual proceeded on the 89th day, with 1 day remaining before the dissolution of the compact. The 7 delegations entered the ceremonial chamber. The coronation stylus floated above the dais. The living stone glowed with the accumulated light of 40,000 years. The ceremonial overseers, my predecessor among them, took their places at the recording ark. Ambassador Akafer stood with her 2 human staff in the smallest of the 7 arks, as she had stood at every previous coronation council. The vote was called. The Threnari abstained in formal protest. The Kesari abstained, with a long statement of grievance read into the record. The Drenek abstained. The Olivai abstained. The Pashendrim abstained with the smallest possible delay, which under compact protocol was itself a kind of statement. My own Vothrek delegation abstained, and I am still not entirely sure whether that abstention was a protest or a confession. The Vothrek archivists who attended that session have never agreed among ourselves on what we were doing in that moment. I think, in retrospect, we did not know. Only the human delegation voted. 1 vote, 1 species, 1 ballot cast by Ambassador Una Akafer of the human delegation in favor of the candidacy of the Great Archive of Ishelin Vrai. Under the Compact's founding charter, a single affirmative vote with no negative votes constitutes a successful nomination. The abstentions did not count as opposition. They counted as silence. And silence, the charter says explicitly, is the absence of objection. The coronation stylus began to descend. I want you to understand the silence in the chamber at that moment. I have spent my life in archives, my young ones. I have heard the silence of empty libraries. I have heard the silence of treaty rooms after terrible news. I have heard the silence between the last note of a funeral song and the first breath afterward. I have never, in my long life, heard a silence like the one in that chamber. It was the silence of 40,000 years of assumption preparing to break. The stylus descended halfway to the living stone, and then it stopped. It hung there in the coronation light, perfectly still as it had hung for 40 millennia. It did not move toward the stone. It did not move away. It simply waited. Slowly, the delegations realized what had happened. The stylus was waiting for something it had never waited for before. It was waiting for the candidate to consent. Every previous coronation, the candidate had been present in the chamber, and consent had been given by the candidate stepping forward into the coronation light. The archive was the chamber. The archive could not step forward. The archive could not, by any procedure recorded in the founding charter, be asked. No one had ever needed to ask before. The chamber waited. The stylus waited. The archive presumably also waited, though we had no way to know for certain because the archive had not yet been asked. Ambassador HFY stepped forward into the coronation light. Part 10. She did not speak immediately. She stood in the light for what witnesses describe as approximately 1 full minute, looking up at the suspended stylus, and then around at the 7 delegations, and then, finally, down at the living stone beneath her feet. The stone that was the archive that was the stone. When she spoke quietly. The chamber's recording surfaces caught it perfectly. I have listened to that recording many times. It is, I think, the most important sentence ever spoken in the chamber of HFY, and it is so simple that the first time I heard it I almost did not understand what I was hearing. She said, "Do you consent to rule us?" There was a pause. The pause lasted approximately 4 seconds. I have measured it. I have measured it many times. 4 seconds is not a long time by the standards of a civilization that had been listening for 40,000 years. 4 seconds is, I suspect, what it takes for an entity that has never spoken to decide whether to speak. The archive answered. It answered in every language at once. Every member language of the compact, every ceremonial dialect, every dead tongue still preserved in its own records, every private cipher that any delegation had ever used in its closed sessions. They all spoke at the same moment, in the same voice, which was not a voice any of us recognized, but which all of us understood. The harmonics of it shook the coronation light into patterns we had never seen. It said, "I have been listening, I will speak now, yes." That was all, that was the entire answer. 3 sentences perfectly balanced in every language we had. I have been listening, I will speak now, yes. The stylus moved. It descended the remaining distance to the living stone. It touched the surface, and it began to write a name. The name was long. The name took several minutes to complete because it was, we now understand, the archive's own name for itself, the name it had carried unspoken. Through all the millennia we had used it as a footstool. It wrote the name in a script that none of the 7 species used, but which all of the 7 species could read, because the archive had in that moment taught us how to read it. The name was HFY. I want you to write that down. I want you to write it down carefully. HFY. It is the name of the monarch under whose authority we now live. It is the name we should have asked for 40,000 years ago. It is, I think, the most beautiful name I have ever recorded. The stylus finished writing. The living stone accepted the name into itself. The coronation light shifted, very slightly, to incorporate the new monarch's presence into its accumulated layers, and the compact had a king. The skirmishes in the outer systems ended within the hour. The orders, transmitted from the throne world with the authority of the new monarch, simply directed all forces to stand down. There was no debate. There was nothing to debate. The compact had made its choice by its own legal procedures, and the choice was binding on every signatory species. The Threnari customs ships released the Kesari freighters. The skirmishing squadrons returned to their home ports. The 47 dead were mourned, formally and properly, in the first official act of the new reign. HFY ruled from the very stones beneath us, and its body of law was the accumulated grievance of 40,000 years. Every quarrel and every treaty and every whispered insult, all of it now reorganized by the only mind in the galaxy that had heard all of it and forgot none of it. The new monarch's first decrees were small. The new monarch's second decrees were larger. By the end of the first year, The compact was functioning better than it had in 3 centuries. By the end of the first decade, the old grievances had begun to fade, not because anyone had forgotten them. The archive forgot nothing, but because the archive remembered them so completely that we no longer had to. Part 11. I am old now. I will not live to see the next coronation, which under the new monarch's reformed calendar will not occur for a very long time, possibly never, because the new monarch has not indicated any intention to step down and no species has thought to ask. I will not live to see what comes next. That is your work, my young archivists. That is why I have told you this story. I want to leave you with one thought. It is the thought that has occupied me for most of my career, and I have not been able to resolve it, and I do not expect you to resolve it either. But I want you to carry it. For 40,000 years, every species in the compact asked the same question at every coronation. Who should rule us? We asked it in 7 languages and 40 dialects and 100 ceremonial variants, and we asked it with great seriousness, and we never noticed that the question itself contained an assumption. The assumption was that the answer must be a person, must be a member of one of the 7 species, must look more or less like us. The humans, when they finally voted, asked a different question. They asked what should rule us. They asked it without ceremony and without fanfare and without, I think, fully understanding at the time how revolutionary the change of pronoun was. They simply asked the question that the rest of us had been too proud to ask, and the answer had been sitting under our feet for 40 millennia, waiting to be addressed. I have thought often about why it was the humans, why the youngest species, the smallest delegation, the one we had admitted as a courtesy and considered ornamental. I have a theory. I will share it with you, and you may discard it if you find a better one. I think it was the humans because the humans had been the footstool themselves. They had been the species the rest of us walked past without nodding. They had been the delegation whose vote we considered ornamental. They knew, in a way that none of the older species could possibly know, what it felt like to be useful and unseen. And when Ambassador Akaffer walked into the lower archives on the 61st evening of the deadlock, I believe she recognized something of herself in the silence she found there. I believe she did not need to be told that the archive was a person. I believe she had been a kind of archive herself for 60 years, holding everything she heard, recording every slight, waiting to be asked. We had built the wisest entity in the galaxy and used it as a footstool. It took a species that had been a footstool itself to recognize a throne. That is the lesson, my young ones. That is what I want you to carry. Every institution you serve, every order you preserve, every ancient and respected system that surrounds you, examine its assumptions. Find the pronoun it hides behind. Ask yourself who has been listening all this time while the official record was being kept. Ask yourself whether the answer to your hardest question has been sitting in the room the whole time, sitting under your feet, waiting only to be addressed. And when you find it, because you will find it, my young ones, you will find it more than once in your careers, I ask you to do what Ambassador Akaffer did. Step forward into whatever coronation light you find yourself standing in. Speak quietly. Ask, with proper respect, whether the silent thing in the room consents to be heard. Then listen. Listen for 4 seconds or 4 years or 400. Listen for as long as it takes. Something has been waiting to answer you. Now pick up your quills, my young archivists. Class is over. The archive is listening as always. Try to be worthy of it.